Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 on the medieval or the Middle Ages, two terms which mean the same thing. And with this lecture, we are going to begin our exploration of music history, having discussed the elements of music in our previous unit. And I can think of no better way to begin our exploration by the same way that my own professor of music history, Professor Mario Falcao, who's a wonderful harpist and also a professor of music history at the State University of New York at Fredonia, where I went many, many years ago when I was your age. Professor Falcao would start off each class by writing some very meaningful and important quote on the board for us to ponder as he lectured. And on the very first day of our very first class, this is the quote that he wrote. This is from T.S. Eliot's poem, Four Quartets. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Kind of an interesting double meaning of end. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. And this is kind of like how I look at history generally. Of course, the word end there doesn't just mean the end of something, but the purpose, right? The purpose of our exploring will be to understand the place where we started, right? And this implies that we can't really understand ourselves, our own place, our own time, until and unless we have explored other places and other times. And I definitely believe this to be true. I'm going to give you another quote. This one I'm going to give you because I'm going to have to apologize in advance for the way that I have to jump back and forth through time from one era to another. It's kind of unavoidable. And this quote is attributed to the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, and it goes something like this: "Life is lived forward, but understood backward." And I think the older I get, the more I feel this is true. But it applies not just to an individual life, but to the study of the past, because we are here in the present looking back at the past, but history or the past or time moves in the other direction, from the past towards the present into the future. And so, for example, in order to understand the Middle Ages, this particular period which we have sort of bracketed off with certain dates and given a name, we have to understand what came before it and what came after it, what is different enough to justify putting it into this category and giving it this name, the Middle Ages, as distinct from what came before, what came after. Well, why is it distinct? What changed? So you're going to see that I have to talk quite a bit about the Renaissance, the period which came after the Middle Ages, because there was so much that changed. What changed defined the Middle Ages, and so I can't really talk about it without talking about what came after. In fact, the very term Middle Ages, or medieval, means the same thing, was applied retroactively by people living in the Renaissance, right? So it's unavoidable, and I apologize in advance. I will do the best I can to keep this narrative sort of clear and linear, but there's going to be some jumping around involved. Let's start actually with the word history itself, because it's sort of a misunderstood term. And in a sort of a common sense usage, people use the word history to mean simply the past. Everything that happened in the past is history. That's not how we use it in a more scholarly sense. History is the study of the past and the attempt perhaps to create a narrative, a story, same root word, to try and draw lessons from the past, etc. And when historians do history, they have traditionally marked off certain eras, and there are four big eras in human history. And the first of these is the prehistorical era. And right off the bat, you can see, well, if history and the past mean the same thing, how could there be a prehistory? How could there be a pre the past? Well, what we mean by prehistory is that period of time from the dawn of man up until the invention of writing, and which coincided with the development of the first cities. Okay. Now, human history goes back a pretty long ways. Human beings just like us, Homo sapiens, have been around in our present form for something like 250, 300,000 years. And of course, we evolved from earlier hominids. And when we emerged from Africa, you all know that Homo sapiens originates in Africa, spreads throughout the rest of the world. When we spread out from Africa into the rest of the world, there were other hominids already there, like the Neanderthals in the Neander Valley of Germany, and Java man and Peking man, or whatever the scientific terms are for these other hominids. But those other hominids, unfortunately for them, went extinct, and we're the only ones left. But human beings, just like us, 250, 300,000 years, and for 98, 99% of all human history, we had the same kind of life. We were hunter-gatherers living in small bands of about 150 people, just trying to survive in a very harsh world. Sometime beginning around maybe 10 or 12,000 years ago, we made the transition from hunter-gatherers to farmers. This is the agrarian revolution. And this is a very long, gradual process, which involved the cultivation and the breeding of certain animals and plants. So, for example, the fruits and vegetables you buy at the store did not just it's not like they were just sitting around and we started eating them. They were the product of painstaking, thousands of years of selective breeding. Same thing with the animals. There was nothing like the modern day cow until the agricultural revolution, when we started herding animals, crossbreeding them for certain desirable characteristics, like the ability to produce a lot of milk or to provide a lot of meat, what have you. Okay, so that was a deliberate process that took thousands of years. But that process led to the development of cities, and then the development of writing. Right? Because if we're settling down now on farms and we have herds of animals, maybe we're living a less nomadic existence than we used to. We need structures, we need barns and houses. We're not living in caves anymore, which means we need people who have different skills. We need specialization of labor. We need some people, and now most people are still going to be out working in the fields all day, but some people maybe need to be making plows, or need to be making wagons or baskets or jars to store all of this food in, because of course the idea is we don't want to be just subsistence farmers. Ideally, we want to store large quantities of grain or whatever to get us through the lean years or whatever. So we need structures. We need people who know how to build them. Right? So specialization of labor. We also might want to trade. Want to trade a certain amount of grain for some horseshoes or something. And cities, of course, one of their functions is they are trading posts, right? There are marketplaces where you can go and trade this for that. Right? So we have the development of cities. We also have the development of writing, because if we're going to be settling down and we're going to be building cities, we're going to be trading, we might need some kind of written records. Now, of course, for most of human history, most people were illiterate, but we might, for example, might just need a basic way of keeping inventory. And in fact, a lot of the earliest writing, which seems to have been invented around 3000 BC or so about 5,000, maybe 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, where also the first cities, what scholars consider to be cities by whatever definition, where the earliest cities arise. Some of the earliest writing that we see, which is what we call cuneiform, is when you take a clay tablet and you have these wooden blocks that you, or wooden implements that you make certain specific impressions into the clay. You bake the clay, and now you have a written record. A lot of these early cuneiform tablets that are discovered turn out to be just inventories of things. So, some archaeologist discovers an ancient text, a clay tablet, and they start deciphering it, and they say it's 50 jars of olive oil, 100 bushels of wheat, what have you. Right? So we need some means of record keeping, and necessity is the mother of invention, and that's kind of how writing comes about. Once we have the first cities and the invention of writing, then we have the beginning of ancient history. Ancient history runs from the invention of writing and the beginning of cities all the way up to the fall of the Western Roman Empire around the middle of the 5th century. The book's date is 450 for the end of ancient history and the beginning of the medieval. We might use other dates. If we want to use a real specific date, it might be 476. That is the year that the last Western Roman emperor, who was a 14-year-old boy, basically retired. He abdicated the throne. He was kind of gently nudged aside and sent to live in a monastery. By that time, of course, the power of the Roman Empire, at least in the West, had already started to subside. That is, the authority of Rome, or actually Ravenna. They had moved the capital to Ravenna because it was easier to defend. It was in the middle of a swamp. Rome had come a long way, unfortunately, from its glory days, and now they were having to hunker down in a swamp. But anyway, the authority of Rome just didn't extend much beyond central Italy, and instead, power in the regions that used to be under the control of the Roman emperor sort of devolved to local strongmen, tribal chieftains, kings, whatever. And so the end of the Western Roman Empire is traditionally what, for a long time, historians used as sort of the marker for the end of ancient history and the beginning of the Middle Ages or the medieval. Right? Now, at the other end of the medieval, the thing that marks the end of the medieval era or the Middle Ages, traditionally, at least for a very long time, was the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, because there was an eastern half and a western half. It was, when people talk of the fall of the Roman Empire, what they're usually talking about is the Western Roman Empire. The eastern half, which is sometimes known as the Byzantine Empire, although they didn't call it that, they just called it the Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. It continued on for another 1,000 years. It went through its own trials and tribulations, and by the end, by the 1400s, it had been reduced to just the city of Constantinople itself, the capital, which is located on this very strategic waterway, the Bosphorus Straits, which connect the Black Sea ultimately to the Mediterranean Sea. Still today, one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. The location of modern-day Istanbul. Istanbul is Constantinople. It was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire until it was finally taken by the Ottoman Turks, who made it the capital of their empire, the Ottoman Empire, in 1453. Now, a lot of other things were happening around the 1450s. It's not like the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire was the only thing going on, but just for convenience sake of bracketing off these dates, that's the year that historians generally used. We can round these years off just a little bit. Instead of 476, 450. Instead of 1453, 1450. And then we have a nice, easy to remember 1,000-year span called the Middle Ages. Some of you also might be familiar with the term Dark Ages. The Middle Ages and the Dark Ages are not exactly the same thing. The term Dark Ages really applies more to the earlier Middle Ages, and they are referred to as the Dark Ages, probably not for the reason you would think, that it was a dark time, it was a I mean, it was a metaphorically dark time. None of us would have wanted to live in the early Middle Ages, I don't think. But the reason it's called the Dark Ages is because we have far fewer written records about that time because the population was so illiterate, right? So it's not that the times were dark, it's that we are in the dark as historians or as people trying to look back and understand about this period of time. It's we who are in the dark because of the lack of written records, because of the widespread illiteracy, right? Okay, so after the Middle Ages, we have the Renaissance, but the Renaissance is really just kind of like the first sub-era of what we might call modern history, right? Now, you might not think of Christopher Columbus or Henry VIII or William Shakespeare or whatever as modern people, but they are, according to this traditional historical designation. They are moderns, right? So again, to review, we have prehistory, hundreds of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers, right? Then we have ancient history, beginning around maybe 3000 BC or so, invention of writing, the first cities, and that extends up till around 450 AD. Then we have the Middle Ages, which extend to about 1450 AD. Scholars may disagree on those dates, but we just have to pick a date. This is really an artificial construct just for helping us understand. It's a bin for us to put our information, our knowledge in to help us just kind of get a grasp on this. And then after that, we have modern history, which we are still living in. Okay, so if we're going to understand the Middle Ages, we have to understand those dates, and I've talked about the dates enough. We might also want to understand what the word means. Why is it called the Middle Ages? It's in the middle. It's in between the ancient world, which was seen in the Renaissance as this glorious, wonderful time, the height of Greek and Roman power and influence and culture and all the beautiful and marvelous things and important things they contributed. The term medieval was applied by people in the Renaissance, right? It was applied retroactively by people in the Renaissance who were attempting a rebirth, a renaissance, that's what the word means, a rebirth of the glory of ancient Greece and Rome. People in the Renaissance just idolized the Greeks and Romans and looked at this long period in between as like a low point in human history. So the term Middle Ages or medieval was a derogatory term. It was a put down. It was like, 1,000 years of misery and ignorance and superstition and disease and war and poverty. So now that itself is sort of a caricature. It wasn't all bad in the Middle Ages. It was mostly bad by our standards, certainly. I don't think any of us would want to live there. But there were better times and there were worse times, I would say. I mean, it's 1,000 years. It's a long period of time. Some periods within the Middle Ages were worse than others. I think, for example, the 1100s, not so bad. You have the first universities springing up, right? You have advances in agriculture, which lead to longer life expectancies, etc. You have relative peace in the 1100s. The 1300s, on the other hand, terrible. Right? You have the breakdown, the corruption of the Catholic Church, which ultimately is, again, one of these things that the loss of the authority and respect, the degradation of the institution of the church is one of these things that leads to the Renaissance. Also in the 1300s, of course, you had the famous bubonic plague, the Black Death, which wipes out something like 1/3 of the population of Europe in the span of maybe 4 or 5 years. You have the 100 Years' War between France and England, various other problems. 1300s, the 14th century, a chaotic and miserable time, really. But the Middle Ages is kind of a mixed bag. There are a lot of beautiful and wonderful and glorious things like the Gothic cathedrals. There's wonderful literature from the Middle Ages. Canterbury Tales, the Decameron, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, etc. But there was a lot of war and misery and death, and life expectancies were short, and most people were lived lives of what we would today consider, poverty and squalor. Even the wealthiest people of the Middle Ages, I would rather be a poor person today in America than a wealthy person in the Middle Ages. The comforts of life, modern medicine, etc. I mean, you can just imagine. Anyway, if we're going to understand the music of the Middle Ages, we kind of have to start with the culture that produced it. And we need to know sort of how society was structured and also what people's mindset was, because it was a very different mindset than what we have today. I think it's safe to say. The ideas, the worldview that the average person in the Middle Ages had in their mind, very different from at least Western Europeans or Americans or whatever today. So we should probably start with the three major categories of people. And there were three kind of rigid classes of people, or what were sometimes referred to as estates. If you recall from your study of the French Revolution, one of the important events of the French Revolution was the summoning of the Estates General. What was the Estates General? What were the estates? There were three estates, and the summoning of the Estates General was like representatives from these three different classes of society, which were, number one, the most powerful during the Middle Ages, the clergy. Now, you might think that the nobility would be more powerful, kings and dukes and whatnot. Actually, the clergy were the first estate, and I'll talk about their role in a minute. The second estate was the nobility, and the third estate were the commoners. Let's start with the clergy. Why would they be so powerful and so influential or what have you? We have to backtrack again. We have to first of all understand that the Roman Empire, which fell in the West around 450, and which continued on in the East, but in the last 150 years or so of the Roman Empire, and then of obviously continuing on in the Eastern Empire, this was a Christian empire. Now, you're all familiar with, the stories of the Romans persecuting the Christians, feeding them to the lions in the Colosseum, and all of that. And it's true, the Romans did persecute the Christians in the early days of the Christian church. They also were very harsh toward the Jews, and partly for the same reason. The Romans were actually religiously tolerant people. As they expanded out from Italy and they conquered various other peoples, they did not impose their own religion. It was understood in those days that different people had different gods. And the Romans, took over some region of Europe or North Africa or Asia, this vast empire which surrounds the Mediterranean Sea. Basically, at its height, the Roman Empire surrounded the entire Mediterranean. So think of Europe, at least southern Europe, Spain, France, most of the island of Britain for a long time, England, the Netherlands, Belgium. They had a hard time with Germany, but Austria, the Balkans, Greece, Turkey, Syria, modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Egypt, all of northern Africa, and back around to Spain again. That whole region, for hundreds of miles inland, was all Roman territory at its height. And that means that as the authority of the empire collapsed, as it became Christianized, that was now a Christian empire in the last, again, 150 years or so, beginning in the 320s with the ascension of the Emperor Constantine, hugely important figure. Anyway, as I was saying, as the Romans invaded some territory, conquered the people, they would tolerate their religion. They would say, okay, you can go on worshiping your old gods, but we're going to put up a temple to Jupiter over here. And this was fine. The problem was when you encountered a people like the Jews who said, no, 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 our God is the one true God. All other gods are false. Well, the Romans didn't like this idea, being told their gods were false. For one thing, it was not just, disrespectful, it was unpatriotic, because Roman gods, for example, included the deceased emperors. If an emperor died and he was considered to be a good emperor, not one of the emperors who was like assassinated or who was hated, but if an emperor died, the Senate would very often declare that he was a god, and temples would be built to him, etc. So it was a real problem if people did not at least tolerate, or better yet, respect the Roman gods in addition to their own gods. The Jews did not do this. This is why the Romans and the Jews clashed. Ultimately, the Romans sacked Jerusalem, destroyed Jerusalem, and the Jews were scattered. That's why the Jews wound up kind of all over the place after being essentially eradicated, expelled from what the Romans called Palestine. Then later, of course, the Romans had problems with the Christians because the Christians felt the same way, that all other gods were false. The Christians were misunderstood by the Romans, or let's say the Christians perplexed the Romans. So what is this new cult I'm hearing about, this branch of Judaism where the son of a carpenter from Nazareth is supposed to be the Messiah? And so the Christians were, of course, persecuted for hundreds of years, but this changed with the ascension of the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. So a little bit about Constantine. Constantine was the son of an emperor, and this is at a time when the empire was divided into an eastern and a western half. It was considered just too big for any one man to rule, so it was formally divided. There was an eastern emperor and a western emperor, and then there were also sort of like understudies. There was a Caesar and an Augustus, so there was sort of like a vice emperor. So Constantine's father, who was an emperor, died, and Constantine's troops hailed him as the new emperor. But the problem is Constantine had rivals. There were others who also claimed the throne. Constantine had to battle them, a series of battles and civil wars that stretched on for quite a while, but ultimately he was triumphant at the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge against one of his rivals, Maxentius. And the reason that Constantine believed he was victorious in this battle is because apparently the night before the battle he had a vision of a flaming cross in the sky, and the words written underneath, "By this sign you will conquer." So the Christian God obviously was backing Constantine. So he went and ordered his troops to paint crosses on their shields. This no doubt perplexed the troops, but they followed their orders. They painted the crosses on their shields. They went out and fought Maxentius's troops, and they were victorious. And Constantine eventually became not just emperor of the West, but sole emperor, because he reunited the empire. This is another one of Constantine's major accomplishments. Reunited the empire and ultimately Christianized the empire. At first, Constantine was tolerant of Christianity, but eventually he actually converted himself, and basically kind of like more or less over a process of decades, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Okay? So as I said, this vast empire became a Christian empire throughout its length and breadth, and that meant when the power of the Roman authorities devolved, there was still the power of the church to fill that vacuum. That's how power works. Nature abhors a vacuum, and if there's a power vacuum somewhere, that vacuum will be filled. And there was an existing institution. By the time we get to the 450s, the church has been around for a while. There are There are bishops in every city with their own diocese, and these bishops are powerful men, especially the bishop in Rome. And they can kind of move in and fill that power vacuum. Right? Of course, the other reason that the clergy is so important is that they are in the business of saving souls. They are in the most important business. The role of the church, each of these different classes has their own function in this sort of social compact. The clergy's job is to save souls. The nobility, that's the warrior class. Their job is to fight the wars, protect the other two classes. They're also the main landowning class, although the church also owns quite a bit of land. So we have a priestly class, a warrior class, and then the worker class, which is like 95 to 98% of the population. The commoners who do all the work. I'll get to these other two classes in a minute, but let's talk about the clergy a little bit more. And also the church that we're talking about here, of course, is the Catholic Church. There are no other churches. Protestantism, the Reformation, that comes later. That comes in the Renaissance, right? Now, it is true that the church, they didn't even call it the Catholic Church really back then. It was simply the church because it was the only Christian church. It was just the church. We do have a split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, which comes to a head in 1054. This is the schism, as it's called, or the splitting between the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is based in Constantinople, the city founded by Constantine. This is another one of his accomplishments, reuniting the empire, Christianizing the empire, and also he built a new capital, moved the capital to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. Anyway, in 1054, there is a rupture between the Western Church based in Rome and the Eastern Church based in Constantinople. And so that's where we get this term Catholic Church. And the word Catholic means universal because, of course, the Roman Church wants to know the Roman way is universal. It's the correct way for everybody. The Eastern Church is called Orthodox, which basically means the correct way. So we have the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Roman Catholic Church, but they have many similar practices and rituals and rites and prayers. Right? It's just that they had some disagreements of doctrine and other issues that led to this split. I'm not going to dwell on the split too much. But in Europe proper, there's really only one church, and it is the Catholic Church. Which means the clergy have a monopoly on this business of saving souls. And it really is, it's kind of a business. You can think of the Catholic Church as like a big multinational corporation. And the CEO is the Pope in Rome. And then there are other lower level executives. You have cardinals, bishops, priests, monks, friars, various different orders of friars and nuns. Right? But anyone who is an anointed member of the clergy, they are these sort of middlemen between ordinary people and God. And this, again, if you're thinking of this idea of a direct relationship with God, that's a Protestant idea that comes later. That's sort of like Luther and maybe Calvin and Henry VIII and all these various breakaway movements who might believe that. The Catholic idea is, no. We have a class of priests whose job it is to interpret the Word of God and tell us what we must do to get into heaven. This is a time when people take their religion very literally and very seriously. And the sort of medieval worldview of the average person is, no matter which class you're from, this is sort of like the basic worldview. Your life here on earth is essentially meaningless. It is of no significance except it is a time of trials and testing and tribulations, and your goal is to get through it however much time you are given, which is probably going to be pretty short, even in the best of circumstances, to get through it with your soul uncorrupted by sin, or to have your sins forgiven before you die so that you can get into heaven where eternal life awaits you. Think of an eternity compared to what? At best, maybe 60, 70 years. Of course, the average lifespan was much shorter than that because of high infant mortality and all that. But people died young and died suddenly in all kinds of ways in the Middle Ages, of diseases, of malnutrition, in battle, in childbirth. So you could die at any time. It was just an understanding. If you had grown up in the Middle Ages, you would see death all around you. Your siblings, probably half of them, would have died before adulthood. So even in childhood, you'd be experiencing quite a bit of death. And it gives you a sense of, well, life is short, chaotic, unpredictable, but there's a promise of an eternal afterlife to come. And you can either spend it in heaven, or you can spend it in hell being tormented. Or maybe you'll spend a few thousand years in purgatory, having whatever sins still attached to you, as long as they're not mortal sins, having whatever sins were left unforgiven or not washed away by the last rites, by the attentions of a priest, right? Maybe you'll spend a few thousand years in purgatory having those sins purged, burned away, so that you can then get into heaven. But the main goal of life here on earth is basically to make it to the afterlife, the only life which is really important. Therefore, things of this earth, secular things, we might say, are unimportant in the grand scheme of things. The only things which really matter are sacred things. So this is a world where we have this stark division between the sacred and the secular. Sacred means anything having to do with religion, with God, with worship. Secular means everything else, everything that has nothing to do with God or religion. One of these things is more important than the other, at least in the mindset of a typical medieval person. Again, this is one of these things that begins to change a little bit as we get into the later Middle Ages. It's not like all of a sudden on January 1st of 1450 the Renaissance begins and everyone's thinking differently. There's a change in attitude that takes really decades and maybe even hundreds of years that paves the way for this new way of thinking, this humanist way of thinking, which characterizes the Renaissance, which we'll get to when we talk about the Renaissance. So the clergy, hugely influential, powerful, because they hold the power of eternal life in their hands. And if you disobey the clergy, you might be in a lot of trouble. Maybe not in this world, but certainly in the afterlife. And so, the clergy, the Pope, for example, had the power of interdiction, which is to forbid even a king from receiving the sacraments. And ultimately, the even worse, even more terrible judgment of excommunication, that is, banishing you from the church altogether. You are definitely going to hell if you are excommunicated. So it's sort of like the ultimate trump card. This is why the clergy are so powerful. Again, as we get to the later Middle Ages, the church, the institution of the church, becomes kind of corrupt. It's not taken as seriously anymore. It loses some of this power. I mean, people still take their beliefs very seriously. They still believe in heaven and hell and all of that. But it's the institution of the church that breaks down to some extent. And we have a crisis, for example, in the 1300s where there are rival popes, both claiming to be pope. So we have a split within the Catholic Church itself, separate from the split with the Eastern Church. There is a schism or a split within the church in the 14th century, in the early 15th century, which kind of contributes to this weakening of the church and the gradual loss of status of the clergy from their place as king of the hill, which they held in the Middle Ages. In fact, people often, will describe the Middle Ages as a theocracy because of the power of the church. And we should also keep in mind the Pope is not just the leader of the church, he's also a ruler of most of Italy, the Papal States. So the Pope does, command armies sometimes. Okay, so we have the clergy, we have the nobility, the warrior class, the landowning class. Now, as we go through the course of the Middle Ages, we will see that The nobility are often clashing, as you might expect, with the clergy, trying to sort of nudge the clergy off of their position as king of the hill. And one of the ways that the nobility do this or bring this about, again, the later we get into the Middle Ages, is by becoming educated, becoming literate. Remember how I said the earlier Middle Ages is often known as the Dark Ages because most people were illiterate. I mean, most people were still illiterate. The commoners, the peasants, they're illiterate all the way through. But toward the later Middle Ages, the nobility begin to take an interest in education because this is one of these ways that they see that, that they can perhaps, first of all, they take an interest in perhaps in education a bit for its own sake and for various practical reasons, but it's also a way of testing the power of the clergy. The clergy were the only people who needed to know how to read and write in order to do their jobs. Obviously, they needed to be able to read the Bible. Although there were probably some illiterate, lower level parish priests in small towns who maybe couldn't even read the Bible. But certainly most of the clergy were educated, they were literate. The nobility, for most, let's say the earlier half of the Middle Ages, certainly were not. They didn't need to know how to read and write. They needed to know how to fight and kill and maybe how to manage their estates. If they needed a person to read a letter to them or to write a letter, they would hire a member of the clergy, right, to serve on their staff. And this person might be called a cleric or a clerk because they are of the clergy. That's where we get the word clerk from. So they didn't need to learn how to read and write themselves. And after all, what's the point of learning to read and write if there are no books? And there were very, very few books in the Middle Ages. Why? Because printing doesn't get invented, at least in the West. Printing with movable metal type is not invented until the beginning of the Renaissance, until roughly, the 1450s. I believe the first Gutenberg Bible is 1455. So before that time, how are books created? Well, they are copied out by hand, by monks in monasteries. And which books are copied and which books are not is completely up to the church, really, right? So certain books are suppressed. And as you can imagine, it's Bibles and religious treatises and stories about the lives of saints or whatever. Those are the kind of books that the church will get its monks set to copying out. And maybe after a year, some monk working away will have created a book. And that book would be priceless. You can imagine a year or two's worth of labor invested into this handcrafted book. Books were tremendously expensive. If in the Middle Ages, if you were a king and you took an interest in books, you might have a library of like 50 books, and that was like a huge deal. I mean, I've got 50 books easily just on that shelf above me that I got for free from from the Goodwill store. But back then, books were tremendously expensive. So again, this is one of these things that marks off the Middle Ages from the Renaissance. Once the price of books comes down because they're available so much more cheaply and easily, then it maybe becomes worth it to learn how to read, right? But before then, there's no interest, in the average person learning how to read. There's no point. There's no books in circulation. The church basically creates the books, and there are very few in circulation. They're tremendously expensive. Okay, so toward the later Middle Ages, the nobility take an interest in reading, in education. There are some practical reasons for this. Remember, I stated that in the 1100s you have the first universities, right? These universities, of course, the professors at all these universities were members of the clergy. And at first, the only subjects that you would study, the only reason you would go to university would be to study theology, maybe so that you could, get a nice job within the church itself. or law. There's always going to be a need for lawyers. We have laws. We need people to, to argue the law or to, represent you in court. Medicine was another subject that you could study in a university. Those are the three big ones, and then the rest was just kind of a grab bag, referred to as philosophy or the liberal arts. Right? But why would you go to a university? Well, again, this kind of relates to the structure of society, especially if we're talking about someone going to university, it's probably a member of the nobility. The commoners are not going to universities. If you're in the nobility, why would you go, or why would you send your son to go study at a university? Well, let's say you are a nobleman, and let's say, I don't know, you and between your first wife who died in childbirth and your second wife who may have survived, let's say you have 12 children, which would not be uncommon. People had as many children as possible, including the commoners. The more children that you have, the more people you have to help with all the work that needs to be done. But if you're a nobleman, of course, you're not really doing any work besides, fighting wars and managing your lands. But let's say you have 12 children. Half of them die before they reach adulthood. That would be typical. So you have 6 children. Let's say you have 3 sons and 3 daughters. The daughters, well, they will be married off to the sons of other noblemen. And these marriages will be used to create alliances between yourself and those other noblemen. That's what marriage really was back then. Love had nothing to do with it. They were arrangements between families to consolidate or to make connections, and also sometimes to consolidate land. Remember, this is a land-based economy. Land is hugely important. Land is wealth. So your daughters are going to get married. Maybe one of them will go and become a nun in a convent someplace. And they will essentially join the families of other families. They're not really part of your family anymore. They will have married into another family. In fact, you will have paid a dowry. You will have paid money to this other family to have the honor of having their son marry your daughter. But fortunately, if your sons marry, you will receive a dowry. Right? So your sons might also marry into other families. But the oldest of your sons to survive will inherit your estate, all of it. It's not going to be divided up. This is what's known as primogeniture. The firstborn son inherits everything. The reason for this is, let's say you have 3 sons. If you divide your lands, your wealth, between those 3, and those 3 in turn divide it between their 3 sons, and on, pretty soon you can imagine your land, your wealth, is now going to be, reduced to, a little plot of land the size of my living room. So, in order to consolidate, to keep this land in one family's hands and prevent it from just sort of being frittered away, the oldest son inherits everything. What if you're a second son or a third son? Well, you might marry, let's say that the nobleman whose estate is next door, he doesn't have any sons. So that's good for you because you marry his daughter, and now you're going to inherit maybe your father-in-law's estates. But another option for second sons, or third sons, or fourth sons, would be, first of all, to join the clergy. Because now, especially if I'm the father, I might send my son, I might dictate that he join the clergy, become a priest, become a bishop, because now I will have a connection to this powerful multinational corporation, the church. And if you really want to rise in the ranks of the church, you might want to get a theology degree. That's like getting an MBA, right? Or you might want your son to become a lawyer, right? That's always handy. Or a physician, even though the doctors didn't really know what they were doing. Medicine in the Middle Ages worked basically on the placebo effect. You were sick, a doctor was called in, the doctor would be dressed like a doctor, he'd have a funny hat, and he would appear to know what he was doing, and this was reassuring to you, and maybe you got better, maybe you didn't. Anyway, that's how universities started out, really, as places for second and third sons who were not going to inherit, who needed something to do, who maybe wanted to advance within the church, or advance within, let's say, the court of a powerful king who would need, learned people around him, lawyers, etc. Right. So this is the beginning of universities. Bologna, I think, is considered the University of Bologna, maybe the oldest university, but very soon the University of Paris, Oxford University. Starting off in about the 1150s or so, over the next couple hundred years, we have universities all over Europe. Okay, so over to the commoners who do all the work, right? Who raise the food, who do all the manual labor. If you want out of that life, as I think I mentioned, there are really only two courses open to you. You can escape to a city. Now, how would you escape? How would you know which way to go? Most people live their entire lives within that little village. The roads were in a state of poor repair after the fall of the Roman Empire, etc., etc. But if you could get away to a city and make yourself useful, not be a beggar, and if you could live there for a while, traditionally a year and a day, maybe as an apprentice to some craftsman or some merchant, then you kind of have your freedom. You would no longer be a serf. Right? Serfs were owned along with the land by the nobility. You did not have freedom as a serf to do as you wanted. You did not own the fruits of your labor. You were given enough food, leftover food to live on, but the produce that you raised belonged to the Lord in the castle on the hill. Another way you could escape that life, very few people did, but there was the possibility of running away to a monastery, becoming a monk if they would let you in, and then you would be trained as a monk. You would be a novice, and then you would eventually be ordained, and so that was another way out of that life. But otherwise, these are very rigid classes of people. Okay, so I need to start wrapping things up, but remember this distinction between the secular and the sacred. Right? This is a world which values the sacred much more than the secular because of their worldview, which I've explained. That means, this is the reason why the art, the architecture, the music, the culture of the Middle Ages, the writings, all of this stuff tends to be sacred in nature, right? Paintings from the medieval, they're all Bible scenes, or Madonna and Child, Jesus on the cross, what have you. The greatest buildings of the Middle Ages. Now, you might like castles. Castles are beautiful buildings, but they weren't built to be beautiful. They were built for a specific purpose as a military fortification. Cathedrals, the great architecture of the Middle Ages, also sacred in nature. Most of the music that was written down from this time is sacred music. So maybe this is the first thing to know specifically about the music of the Middle Ages. The vast majority of music from the Middle Ages, which has survived to the present day, is sacred music. It was music written specifically for use in church. Right? There was some secular music. We'll study that separately. Most of the secular music we have that has survived to the present day, that was written down, that's from the later Middle Ages, when the institution of the church was breaking down, when the nobility take more of an interest in arts and culture, become literate, become better educated. So let's stick with the sacred music. The sacred music of the Middle Ages, the most important sacred music, the origin, really, of all sacred Christian music, is something called Gregorian chant. Now, we should really refer to it more generally as chant, not just Gregorian chant. What's the Gregorian part? What is that? Well, there were, in the beginning, in the early days of the church, there were many, many different kinds of chant. There were different religious practices throughout this vast area, the former Roman Empire. what might be called Christendom, the Christian lands, right? There are bishops all over the place. There are individual modes of worship, and there are different chants. Well, as the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, it came to a position more of like the leader, the acknowledged leader of the church, not just the Bishop of Rome, not just like first among equals, but really the head of the church. This was not recognized immediately. This was a gradual process of the Bishop of Rome becoming recognized as the leader of the church, and it begins perhaps with Pope Gregory, for whom Gregorian chant is named. Pope Gregory was pope from 590 to 604, so very early medieval, and I won't go into him too much. He was a pope who attempted to standardize worship and standardize practices, and in doing so kind of asserted his role as the leader of the entire church. Right? So maybe the first really powerful pope in that sense. He did not, however, compose Gregorian chant. He didn't write the music, he didn't write the texts, he didn't sign his name on the book of Gregorian chant. What happened was there were many, many different styles of chanting over the years, and the Pope, not Pope Gregory, but the church sought to standardize worship, make it all the same, because after all, there's got to be one right way and a whole bunch of wrong ways, and we want to make sure everybody's doing it the right way, right? So that applied not to just, let's say, the rituals, the prayers, but the chants, right? So the church said, look, the way you guys are chanting over there and the way you guys are chanting over there, it's wrong. We're going to have one standard body of chant, one repertoire of chant, Gregorian chant. The attaching of Gregory's name to it was basically sort of applying a seal of approval, like this is the official chant. It was something that was done retroactively by the church to give it legitimacy. And they invented a story to go along with it. They said, here's how the chant came about. Pope Gregory, back in the day, Pope Gregory is sitting in his study, and the Holy Spirit, in the form of a dove, flies in the window and lands on his shoulder and starts gently warbling the chant into Gregory's ear, or in some accounts, into his mouth. And Gregory started writing it down, and thus the chant was born, right? So this is a way of saying, look, this chant comes directly from God via the Holy Spirit to Gregory, and from Gregory to us. This is the official correct chant. But in reality, we know that Gregory had very little to do with it. Probably most of these chants were created long after Gregory died. But that chant which came to be official and officially accepted is known as Gregorian chant. I'm going to talk about the musical aspects of it next time, but what the chant is at a fundamental level, it's simply prayer that is sung, that is chanted or sung instead of spoken. So we need to talk a little bit about the types of prayer, the types of services, or the liturgy of the Roman Catholic Church. There are two broad divisions of types of services. There's the Mass. You're probably familiar with, if you're Catholic, or if you have friends who are Catholic, going to Mass, as we sometimes say instead of going to church. The church is a building. The Mass is what goes on inside that building. We have the Mass, and we have the office, which is another type of service. The Mass is understood to be everybody. All of the faithful are compelled to participate in Mass. And Mass goes on every day. Of course, if you're a peasant and you've got work to do, you might only go on Sundays. But Mass happens every day. The office is a different mode of worship, a different branch of liturgy, a different set of prayers and rituals that is for officials of the church themselves. That's why we call it the office. It is kind of like more geared toward the clergy. Now, if you are a particularly pious person and you have the time to participate in the office, you can. You might go to your local monastery where the monks every 3 hours are compelled to file into the church and pray and chant, because that's what the office is. It's going on all day, a different prayer every 3 hours, roughly. Right? Some of these prayers you might be familiar with, like Vespers, or Matins, or Lauds, Compline. There are various different episodes within the office, which is just ongoing. And that's a big part of your life as a monk or a nun. The Mass, for everybody, can be further divided into two categories of prayer. Some prayers, some, rituals associated with prayers that are chanted, whatever, some of them are the same every single day. Every single day of the church calendar. You might not have been aware of this. The church has an elaborate calendar. Every day has special significance. This is where we get saints' name days from. St. Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's Day. Every day is some saint's day, and other, of course, there are church holidays like Easter and Christmas and whatnot. But every day is of some special significance in the church calendar. Some prayers stay the same every single day in the church year. Those are called the ordinary prayers. Some prayers change. The text of the prayer will change depending on what day it is in the church calendar. Those are the proper prayers of the Mass. So we have parts of the Mass that are ordinary and parts that are proper. We're going to focus more on the ordinary of the Mass. This is probably somewhat familiar to you. You might not be aware that you're familiar with it unless you're Catholic. But these 5 prayers are still chanted or spoken, maybe not sung in Catholic churches anymore. It's just that they're done in English, if you're in an English-speaking country, or in French, if you're in France. They are now done in the vernacular languages, the locally understood and spoken languages, instead of in Latin. So this is another thing to understand about this prayer and these chants. The texts of almost all but one, really, of these prayers are in Latin. Latin was the official language of the church. It was the language that bishops and popes corresponded in when they wrote letters to each other. To this day, I believe when the pope makes an official pronouncement, it is written first in Latin. That changed, by the way, in the 1960s when, because of the Second Vatican Council convened by Pope John the 23rd, the Catholic Church changed to having Mass in the vernacular, in the locally understood languages. But for a very, very long time, it was in Latin. The one exception, by the way, is the very first prayer of the 5 ordinary prayers of the Mass. That is the Kyrie. That's in Greek. The 5 ordinary prayers, very briefly, are the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. The Kyrie goes like this. I can recite the whole thing in Greek. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. Christ have mercy. Lord have mercy. Christ have mercy. Lord have mercy. The Gloria, Gloria in excelsis Deo et in terra pax. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace. It goes on and on from there. The Credo is just the Apostles' Creed. The Sanctus and the Agnus Dei you might be familiar with. Agnus Dei means Lamb of God. Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi miserere nobis. Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Have mercy on us. That line is repeated. Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi miserere nobis. And then finally, Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi dona nobis pacem. Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, grant us peace. You may be familiar with these prayers. Those prayers were normally chanted or sung. Those ordinary prayers and the proper prayers and all of the prayers of the office over here, right? Those chanted prayers are Gregorian chant, and we'll learn more about it next time. See you then.